Morning, everyone, and welcome to the Be Future Ready webinar series. This webinar series is designed to provide you with valuable information on a range of different topics to support you when thinking about your future and the potential career pathways open to you. So today marks our fourth webinar, and I'm delighted that we've got Simon Banks with us today. Before I hand over to Simon, however, I'd like to remind attendees of the format. So Simon's going to run through a short 15-minute presentation on the topic of university admissions processes before leaving some time at the end to answer some of your questions. Please write your questions in the chat whilst the session is running, and we'll look to get to as many as we can before we finish up at around 11:20. But any questions we don't get to, we'll be sure to send around follow-up answers afterwards. So as I mentioned before, Simon is going to be talking to you about the university admissions process. Simon is an admissions tutor at University College London. So Simon, I'll hand over to you. If we can just, unmute. That would be great. Yeah.
That's a really good start. Thank you, Megan. Welcome everybody. As Megan says, my name's Simon Banks. I am the Director of Education and Faculty Tutor at UCL Engineering, but I've spent a lot of time in my career looking at admissions across a number of areas. So I'm going to talk today about my advice and top tips for how to apply successfully. So I'm going to share my screen, and I have a presentation as Megan says, so I hope you can all see that. So I've sort of gone off piste here a little bit, and I've changed the title to something that I think captures what I'm going to say, to applying to university properly. And really what I'd like to get through in the next 15 minutes or so is my view as to what distinguishes a good but formulaic application to a university from a really outstanding application that conveys a genuine enthusiasm and desire to study the subject. And so I've gone for the iceberg metaphor, which you'll be familiar with, but basically the idea here is that people, when they're applying to university, very often will focus on the bits up the top here, the bits that can be seen. People will be very nervous about the interview. What's going to happen? How do I prepare? And indeed, schools might very often spend time helping you to do practice interviews. But to get to the interview, you have to get past the application stage, which is also quite visible in terms of, you know you have to write your personal statement, you know you have to have your references and so on. But the bit that comes before that is arguably the most important part, and that is the research element. So I want to dive straight into that and have a look about what I mean by research. This can be boiled down very simply into the message that there is no point in doing really well in your application and acing your interview if you're applying for the wrong thing. So you want to make sure that you are applying for the right thing, both in terms of what you are going to study, but also where you are going to study it. And you can imagine getting either one of those right, but still ending up in the wrong situation. So it may be that you absolutely nail what you want to study and you understand that, but you apply to the wrong place. And that's really tricky, because once you're in, it's a big deal to sort of leave somewhere and go somewhere else. It's maybe a little bit easier the other way around. You get the right place, but not quite the right program. Many universities will allow you to make some changes once you're there, but that's not necessarily guaranteed. They may not have the spaces on the program that you really want to be on. So trying to marry these things up and get them both right from the start is important. And how do you do that? Well, you do some research and you really look at what it is that you're applying for and the place that you're applying to. So let's have a look at what I will study. And the key here is basically to know your subjects. And a really good test of this is, can you answer those first two questions? Why this and why not that? So I'm a chemist by background, so I work in engineering these days, but I've spent most of my career working in chemistry. And a big question that I used to ask students when they would come in through the door for interview was, why didn't you apply to do chemical engineering? And that was something that very often caught people off guard, because they knew what chemistry was, or they thought they knew what chemistry was. But there are other related disciplines that are quite similar but distinct. And it's just as important to be able to ask yourself that question and to be able to answer that question Why am I not applying for this potentially closely related subject? And so, for example, if we go down that chemistry line, you could think of potentially chemistry, biochemistry, chemical engineering, biochemical engineering, a whole range of subjects that are available to you at university, which may not be available to you at A level. You know, you don't often get A levels in things like biochemical engineering. And so what you need to do is say, am I just applying for this subject because it's familiar through my studies before university, or is it because I genuinely know and understand what this is and what the available possible alternatives are, and I have actively chosen that? And then you want to look at it and think about, is this a short-term wish? Is this something I want to do because maybe I can't think of anything else? Maybe I just have an inherent desire to study this subject and I'm not going to worry about what goes beyond it. Or are you heading in a particular direction in your longer term career aspirations? Now, none of those is a right or wrong answer. There's absolutely nothing wrong. Indeed, I love the idea of people studying something for its own intrinsic value. But it's important to ask yourself and challenge yourself to know where you sit on that spectrum. Because if your aim is longer term, you want to make sure that the subject you're choosing genuinely satisfies the needs of that longer term career. Or at least gives you a foothold that you might jump off from to go to other study that will ultimately lead in that path. So have a little bit of a think about what your short, medium and long-term aims are, and consider whether what you're applying for meets those aims. So that's all very well. That's what I suggest you want to know, but how do you do it? Well, we've got some obvious things there. Websites. Go on to university websites and look at what they say. Be wary of the prospectus entries, I would suggest, simply because the prospectus, if you think about it, is a little bit like an advertising document. It's trying to draw you in. It's saying, come to us because we're really good, study what we're offering because it's really great. But behind the prospectus, you will find departmental websites that have things like staff research pages. Are you looking beyond just what you will study in your undergraduate course? And are you looking at what the richer life of the department is? When Professor X goes off from their lecture that they've given you and wanders off down the corridor to their research environment, whether that's a laboratory or a library or a museum special collection, do you understand what it is that they are doing there? Now, nobody's expecting you at this stage to be reading their academic papers and sort of critiquing their expertise, but some understanding of that life beyond the undergraduate course will help to inform you when you're making that decision about whether this is the right discipline for you. And you can look to other places as well, for example, societies. I don't really mean here student societies, although they can actually be a really good source of information if you approach them. But I'm thinking there are things like learned societies. As I say, I'm a chemist. The Royal Society of Chemistry will undoubtedly be helpful if you're interested in that sort of area. Engineering, as I say, again, a bit of an engineering sciences slant here, just given my background, but there will be equivalents in other areas as well. The Engineering Council, the professional engineering institutions. In the arts, you could look to things like the Society of the Arts. You can look to a range of professional regulatory bodies that might accredit degree programs, and ask them or look at their websites to see what they say about their subjects and their disciplines. And then there are books, and I'll mention books again a little bit later on, but websites and so on are great, but books that talk about the discipline, there's still a wonderful place for real, tangible books, in my opinion. So you might want to think about that. Where will I study it? Ask yourself, is this the right university for me? But also, am I right for it? So those questions can sort of be left hanging a little bit, but there are different types of university. There are campus-based universities. There are metropolitan universities that are more distributed and dispersed around their locality. Do you want to be in a big city? Would you rather be in a country? Do you want to be close to home? Do you want to be far away from home? Honest, objective review of those questions to make sure that you're really going for the right place. The prestigious course in the wrong place will not serve you well, because you need to be comfortable where you are when you're studying. And each university has its own feel and its own ethos. If you can visit, that's great, but that can be challenging for people because, you know, it can be costly and it does mean a certain amount of investment of time and what have you. Visit where you can, but if not, seek out those other sources of information. So that's a bit about the research. I'll move on now to the application. I've tried to encapsulate in 3 points here, and this applies both to the personal statement and also potentially to the interview, which I'll come on to. What do you want to convey in your application? Now, bear in mind that universities receive many, many thousands of these applications, and you want to make yours stand out. You can't do that through formatting because UCAS is very strict about the formatting. It's all plain text and so on. You want to convey that you understand what the program is. And that goes back to having done your research. There's absolutely no point in writing a wonderful personal statement to apply for English literature. But actually what comes through is that you're terribly interested in history. You want to make sure that you're conveying that understanding of the program. You want to show that you're enthusiastic about the program. And this is challenging in 4,000 characters of plain text. And you don't want to come across as being over the top. So there's a delicate balance, but you want to show that you have a genuine desire to study this. It might be because you want to say, because I want to go on to this future career path. It might be because you say, excuse me, because I have been inspired previously by this experience of the discipline, and that's made me realize I want to understand it in more depth. There's an enthusiasm that comes through when someone is speaking from the heart and speaking as themselves. And in that, I would suggest you do genuinely write your personal statement yourself, and you avoid the use of a thesaurus or any other sort of tendency towards over-verbose language that's not your own voice. Speak as yourself, and that's the best way to convey that enthusiasm. And you want to make sure that you say that your background is relevant, and that really comes through in the personal statement. So I'll treat that aspect of relevance first. How do you show that your background that you're writing about is tied to the expertise that you will need to exhibit in the course of the program and potentially in the course of the career that follows? Usually a personal statement is split into 2 bits, and I think that you will have read some of these yourself potentially. You talk a bit at the start about the discipline, and then at the end there's usually a bit, and I would suggest maybe not too much, maybe no more than about 25%, that talks about other things you do. I like to play tennis, I play the flute, I am working in a shop. Those kind of contextual bits of information. My suggestion to you in both sections where you're writing about prior experience is that you, for each example of something you do that you give, you draw a through line that relates it to the program and the discipline for which you're applying, or the skills that might be relevant to a student at university. So, for example, I play football at the weekends and I'm captain of the team. Well, great. Okay, you've got teamwork skills in there. You've got leadership skills in there. People have thought that you have the attributes necessary to lead. Draw out the implications of what you've said and relate it to what might be needed as a student at university. Teamwork may or may not be relevant to your degree directly. If you're doing engineering, absolutely core. Other disciplines, maybe not so much, but think about how that links through. Similarly, in the more academic part of your personal statement, if you say, I've read this book, be careful. I did say I'd mention books. I read a lot of personal statements that tell me about the books people have read. That's only useful to me if you can say why it was helpful to you. Knowledgeable and enthusiastic, they're sort of a given, and I've mentioned them before. And I just want to say one word on complete. The complete aspect here relates to making sure that you don't leave anything out that might be relevant. Don't assume we will get it. Don't assume because you've studied A-level computer science that we know that you are enthusiastic about programming. If you are, write it down. References, I just put those in there. If you get a chance to sit down with the person who writes your reference and talk to them about why you're applying, that will come through in the reference. So please try to do that. And then last of all, interviews. I'll leave this up in a minute whilst we take questions and let you read it as well. Read your personal statement before you go into your interview. It's the last thing I read before I interview you, so it should be the last thing you read before I interview you, because I'm going to ask you about its contents. And if you can't remember what you wrote, it's not a good start. Be prepared to discuss what you wrote. If you've slightly over-egged the pudding in what you've written, I love such and such, and then I ask you about such and such, because I think that's a nice gentle opener for you, and actually you don't know too much about it. That's a weakness from the word go in the interview. So be prepared to speak to those things. Don't be afraid to say I don't know. That's absolutely fine. But don't say I don't know and sit there in silence. Say I don't know, but this is how I would go about answering that question. We want to know how you think, not just what you know. The idea isn't that you come to us with all the knowledge, it's that you come to us with the potential. I say us, the higher education sector. You come into university with the potential for us to educate you, to, with you then realising your full potential. But don't be worried about interviews. They're a conversation. They're not an interrogation. So those are my top tips. I think I've just about done the 15 minutes. I'm very happy now to take any questions that you have on any of those things.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you so much for that presentation, Simon. We have had a few ones come in. So the first one, we've got a student asking if UCL specifically looks for anything in their students who are attending to apply to UCL. So I guess it's quite a UCL specific question, but if there's anything that, yeah, you could advise on that.
Well, one thing that UCL doesn't do very much actually is interview. So you, therefore, the vast majority of programs at UCL do not interview, and certainly no programs in engineering, for example, interview. And so you have to focus more on your personal statement and your that aspect of your application. And in that, no, we're not. It would be hard for UCL as a whole, with its many departments and many disciplines, to have one thing that it was looking for. But I would go back to those parts, those general aspects of the knowledge about the topic and the enthusiasm for it, and how you demonstrate that based on your past experience. We don't look for things in the majority of cases like work experience, because not everybody has had the opportunity to do that. But where you have, put it in by all means, but where you haven't, talk about the other things that you've done to maximize the opportunities. And focus on those.
Yeah, that's great, because actually it leads on to another question about a student asking whether universities will perhaps be a bit more lenient about sort of the relevant work experience for 2022 entries, given obviously the pandemic.
So some universities and some courses may have requirements that say they would prefer you to have work experience in certain areas, or it's an advantage if you can. As I say, I think generally speaking, people in the higher education sector are very aware that things like work experience, your ability to access work experience, can depend very much on your personal circumstances. And so there are those people who will be in situations where it's easy, either through connections or school schemes, to access work experience, and others who simply don't have that route in. And so what we try to do, certainly very much in my experience, what we try to do is to minimize any emphasis on that and not make that a requirement. And so yes, I would expect that the leniency to be there. I can't speak for every university and every program, but I certainly think if you are applying to programs where they have written in advance, we do prefer students to have work experience in these areas, and you are struggling to find that, I suggest contacting the admissions tutor or the program director and raising that with them directly outside the application process and explaining the situation so that you can discuss that. Certainly, were anyone to do that with me, I would be absolutely open to that conversation and fully aware of the need for leniency at the moment.
Okay, fantastic. I'm aware we're sort of out of time, but I was thinking we could just get to one more because we've got the interviews bit up on screen. There's a student who's been asking about sort of body language in interview settings and whether that's important. So things like talking with your hands, I guess, sort of just gesticulating, that sort of thing. So if you've got an experience of
Well,
whether that's a good thing to have.
I'm really conscious at the moment because I've got two screens and the camera's there and my screen's here. So I'm conscious my body language is awful because I'm sort of not looking at the audience as I'm talking, which is no great. So I'll try and do that now. And I sort of wave my hands a bit about. When I'm lecturing in the old days, I very often used to hold a big pointy stick that I would use to point up at the board because I found it kept my hands nice and stable. Body language, I wouldn't worry about it too much because the reality is the more you worry about it, the more you're focused on that instead of focusing on the person. As I say, the interview is a conversation. There may be some environment, to be perfectly honest, I've not come across them myself, but one hears these sort of horror stories of people where the interview is somehow about some detailed forensic analysis of your ability to solve complex problems. I think that's more myth than reality. I think that most people who are interviewing students, what they want is they want the student to come out to show their personality and their reasons for applying and what it is that really fires them up about the subject. And yes, there might be some technical questions in there, but as I say, don't worry if you don't know. So body language, I just wouldn't give it a second thought. The same way people often ask me about what to wear. And my advice on that one is always the same. You know this is a professional environment. You're not going to turn up dressed as you would be dressed for the beach. But at the same time, you don't have, again, in my experience, you don't have to wear a suit or the equivalent, get dressed up in something you might wear into a boardroom or on The Apprentice. It's a professional environment, but not necessarily a terribly formal one. And what we're interested in is really what's in your head, rather than how you're sitting and whether you're waving your hands about a bit too much or what have you. Try to minimize the ums and the ers. That's the only thing. Pause, breathe, and then speak.
That's really great advice. Thank you very much for that, Simon.